I wanted to put my library in a place known for integrity, character, optimism, loyalty, and truth. That certainly narrowed it down.
I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune. On behalf of my colleagues at the Trib, I want to welcome you to the 2020 Texas Tribune Festival. Every one of the 11 years we've been in business, the work of our nonprofit newsroom has been critically important, but never more than this year. We produce reliable, credible reporting on issues that affect everyday Texans, making them better informed and motivating them to participate civically. You and people like you, readers, supporters, attendees at our events, make our public service journalism possible. Help us keep our essential reporting free for everyone to access by becoming a Texas Tribune member at texastribune.org/give. Now on with the show. I hope you enjoy this conversation between former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates and Margaret Brennan, moderator of Face the Nation and senior foreign affairs correspondent for CBS News.
Hi, I'm Margaret Brennan, moderator of Face the Nation and senior foreign affairs correspondent at CBS News. Thank you all for joining us today for this virtual conversation. And on behalf of the Texas Tribune, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2020 Texas Tribune Festival and my interview with Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense under Presidents Bush and Obama, a former CIA director and intelligence analyst for many years. And of course, he also is a veteran. He served in the U.S. Air Force. He's the author of a number of books, most recently, Exercise of Power, American Failures, Successes, and a New Path Forward in the Post-Cold War World. So this session will last 30 minutes. That's not nearly enough time to get through the career I just laid out for you that Robert Gates has had, but we're excited to be able to tackle a number of key topics that we're all dealing with in this COVID world. And if we can begin, Secretary Gates, it's great to have you.
Margaret, it's great to be with you again.
I want to start on the crisis that is keeping us all in its grips, and that is the pandemic. This is the biggest national security threat of the Trump presidency. How do you think the U.S. has responded?
I think in several ways, both positive and negative, Margaret. I think that the decision, for example, to leave openings and closings to state and local officials was the right decision. Things vary, the conditions vary in this country dramatically, not only from state to state, but within states. By the same token, it seems to me that the federal government at the very beginning of this should have taken on the logistical responsibility for providing PPE and the equipment necessary to deal with the pandemic. The notion of the states competing with each other and even with foreign countries to gain access to the equipment, I think, was kind of ridiculous. And this is one part of it where the federal government, I think, could have played a significant role, both internationally and here at home, in acquiring the materiel necessary to fight this pandemic.
I mean, it seems to me that this is such a massive crisis that there needs to be some kind of, similar to post 9/11, massive probing of our national response. Much of the conversation now is still on sort of the personalities. But, one of the things I want to highlight here, because of your background as intelligence, is just what was actually getting to the president's desk. We know in Bob Woodward's book that he writes, and the director of national intelligence confirmed, that the very first time the president was told about the virus is January 23rd. And at that time in China, U.S. intelligence said this will be no worse than the flu. 5 days later, the national security advisor tells the president this is the largest national security crisis you're ever going to face. In February, the president, the White House, is being told by health officials that the virus is just among a handful of people with ties to China. Meanwhile, it's spreading, coming in from other parts of the world. Given all of this, hasn't the United States just demonstrated to the world that we are incredibly vulnerable to a health crisis? And is this a national security intelligence failure?
I think that it is a national security crisis. There's no question about it. And it has had a big impact on our country, not just in terms of the terrible number of lives lost, but our economic strength and even to a certain extent earlier on in terms of our military readiness. I think the way to look at this is that the information in a situation like this evolves. And often there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty at the beginning. And as you learn more, you change your views. As more information comes in, you're able to provide greater clarity to the decision maker so that they can make informed decisions. So I think that we had allowed over time, and not just in this administration, but over time had allowed our capabilities to deal with a pandemic, our preparation, our stockpiling of PPE and things like that to deteriorate. We've probably allowed our international connections in terms of communication on these kinds of issues to deteriorate. So I think one of the lessons learned from what we've experienced so far, at least from a national security standpoint, is first of all, the need to get back to a position where we are prepared, where we anticipate that these kinds of pandemics will continue to happen from time to time in the future, and that we need to be prepared to deal with it from the very beginning in terms of stockpiling and so on. It's very hard in a democracy to allocate resources for a problem you don't yet have. But this is a situation where we know we're going to face these kinds of situations in the future. We should have known that this would be coming along in one way or another. It was predicted by a lot of people, Bill Gates and others, and we should have been better prepared.
So how should the national security community adjust? I mean, it was in the worldwide threat briefing, but should this be directed from the White House down?
Well, it first of all it's important that people who are not normally seen in the National Security Council meetings and in the Situation Room be involved from the beginning in terms of planning, and that would be people from the Department of Health and Human Services, people from the Centers for Disease Control, from the National Institutes of Health, the various scientific and medical institutions and organizations that are actually the ones that know how to deal with these things, be involved in the decision making from the very beginning. But it does need to, if you're going to do the kind of thing I talked about in terms of the federal government getting involved in the logistics, the Department of Defense would probably have to be involved in that. And so you would have to have defense and as well as these other organizations involved. You would need to have the State Department and their international relationships with international institutions and so on. So it is a whole of government kind of problem, but you need to get all the right people in the room from the very beginning.
In the wake of this pandemic, it's been said that China's really sort of using it to its advantage to flex its muscles. Hong Kong, an example of them taking advantage of an opportunity there to sort of reassert control. What do you think happens next? I mean, should we be looking at this as further Chinese military expansion?
I think what you're seeing is China taking advantage of a time when they see the United States facing real problems at home, not just the virus and the number of deaths and illnesses, but the impact on our economy, the paralysis in our politics, and so on. I think there's no question that China has moved to exploit the impact of the pandemic on us, whether it was taking advantage to make their move on Hong Kong, the threats that they have posed, the intimidating activities they've engaged in with respect to Taiwan, challenging the Chinese, challenging the Indians in the Himalayas on their border. So I think having stumbled and created real problems for themselves at the very beginning of this, as they have moved quickly to try and reassert control, get control of the disease at home, they have now moved to the next step, which is exploiting the opportunities that this has provided. One of those opportunities is the U.S. decision to basically go it alone in terms of trying to deal with the pandemic. So when we withdraw from the World Health Organization, we simply create an opportunity for the Chinese to move in and exercise even greater influence there. My view is, I think we should stay and try and fix it rather than leave, because when we leave, it's like us picking up our football and going home because we don't like the way the game's been played, instead of trying to figure out how to fix it. So I think the Chinese have taken advantage in a number of different ways, and now they're reaching out and offering vaccines to developing countries and so on. And I think you'll see more of that. And the question is, how does the U.S. respond? Do we prioritize our own people for the vaccinations, or what role do we play in the international environment in this?
It sounds like you're suggesting there that vaccine nationalism is something you would advise the U.S. any U.S. president against.
Well, I think it's one of these things where, again, I think we need to be part of an international community and trying to figure out how we can't isolate ourselves from other countries. We've seen that with the pandemic. If I think every country is likely to prioritize its own needs first. Right. Whether it's the Europeans or the United States or China or Russia. The question is, in the second phase, in the second step, how do you have some kind of an international cooperative effort that reaches out to others? Because we can't all isolate ourselves.
Bob Woodward, in his new book, has a number of interesting stories. But one of the things related to China is this extraordinary face-to-face encounter between Jim Mattis, who was then defense secretary, and his Chinese counterpart Wei, where they're walking around and he's explaining to him that the U.S. and China would like to get along, but he directly confronts him on President Xi's violation of his pledge not to militarize the Spratly Islands. And he not so subtly points out and says, the first country I'd go to war with is one where their armies haven't seen combat, which was a dig at the Chinese there. I mean, given that, what do you think are the prospects for a hot war in China?
Well, I hope that they're very low, but it is going to require careful management of the relationship, both in Beijing and in Washington. The reality is Xi Jinping, through his assertiveness in the last couple of years, has managed something no one else in the world has managed, and that is to bring Republicans and Democrats together in agreement on something. And that's a tough line toward China right now. Mm-hmm. And so the question is Xi going to take the next step beyond Hong Kong and begin to put pressure more than just intimidating exercises and so on Taiwan? And what would the U.S. response to that be? And how much more aggressive are they going to be in the South China Sea and places like that? So my worry right now is the assertiveness and aggressive behavior of President Xi of China that I think raises the likelihood or the chances of an incident that has the potential to escalate. So, I think the United States, we have carried out our foreign freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, which we have been doing forever, right. And frankly didn't do so much of in the Obama administration. But those are perfectly legitimate assertions of international rights and so on. So I don't see the U.S. as actually being the provocateur in this situation. I see the Chinese as being very assertive, and And that raises the risk, but neither country wants an out-and-out conflict. Neither country can afford such a conflict, and so the question is, how do you better manage this relationship to ensure that while we are rivals and we compete, and we know we're going to be competing against each other for forever, for as far into the future as anybody can see, how do you maintain a peaceful cohabitation between these two superpowers going forward?
You mentioned Taiwan there as an area you're concerned about. I realize that we are treaty allies, but should an American president actually be expected to respond militarily if China takes action against Taiwan?
Well, we actually don't have a treaty relationship, and the U.S. policy for a long time
to help
but
protect and support
we have
them.
said we would be there for China,
Right?
but we have actually over the decades had a policy of strategic ambiguity, sort of left it unclear what we would do, and depending on what the Chinese did. In other words, if the Chinese were to attack Taiwanese held islands off the coast of China, would that provoke a U.S. response, and so on?
Right.
My own view is that this is a situation where we need strategic clarity, not strategic ambiguity. And we ought to tell the Chinese that we have a message for two parties. We ought to tell the Chinese that if you unprovoked attack Taiwan, the United States will protect Taiwan and will intervene militarily to stop it. By the same token, we need to tell the Taiwanese, if you unilaterally declare independence or you unilaterally decide to change the status quo in a way that is provocative, you are on your own.
We haven't heard anything that clear from either President Trump or candidate Biden. Does it need to be
or their
said?
predecessors?
Right.
As I say, the U.S. policy has been strategic ambiguity, and there are a lot of people, including a lot of foreign policy experts and geostrategists, who say we ought to maintain the strategic ambiguity. My concern is that strategic ambiguity creates a gray area in which there is the chance for a miscalculation.
On North Korea, you told me last year that you don't believe North Korea will ever denuclearize. Does that mean the next president, or if there's a second Trump term, that the position needs to accept North Korea as a nuclear power and just try to continue what has been completely unsuccessful diplomacy?
Well, we've tried under 4 different presidents to make progress with North Korea and denuclearizing, and we've tried everything, every conceivable avenue of diplomacy. We've tried bilateral talks, we've tried multilateral talks, we've tried 6-power talks, we've tried with the Chinese. None of it has worked. So at a certain point, the old definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. I believe that Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime believes that nuclear weapons are critical for their survival. I don't believe, as I said to you last year, I don't believe they're ever going to completely give up their nuclear capability. So the question is then, do you try to negotiate that capability down to the minimum possible level and maybe negotiate an end to their ballistic missile testing so their ability to deliver the weapons is significantly inhibited, and move forward from there? I'm open to alternatives, but so far none of the alternatives practiced over the past 25 years by 4 different presidents have worked.
So accept it, but try to get diplomacy to actually work.
Well, I think the key is, how do you get the number of the weapons they're allowed to have down to the smallest possible number, and accompany that with any time, any place inspections so that you have confidence that they're not doing something in secret.
Is there any doubt that Russia is the most immediate threat to the 2020 elections, given what you've seen and what is public from U.S. intelligence?
I think they are probably the most aggressive in trying to influence our elections. I think the Chinese are at work as well. I think you might even have some efforts perhaps more on the crude side by Iran and North Korea, but by far, in terms of scale, I think that the Russians are the most involved and the most deeply engaged.
Why has the U.S. been completely unable to deter their interference?
Well, I think we have deterred them in some ways. We've gone after some of these sites in Russia where some of these hacks have taken place, where some of these bots are being placed on our networks and so on, where some of this false information is being implanted. My own view, and actually I talk about this in the book you mentioned at the beginning, I think we need to be more aggressive in using our cyber capabilities to give the Russians and others a dose of their own medicine, to get past their firewalls and tell their people what their regime is doing about their corruption of Medvedev and Putin and all the people around them, and in effect tell them, two can play this game as well as one. And,
what does that look like?
Well, I think it involves our basically getting on their networks like they are on our networks to convey our messages. We did this aggressively during the Cold War. The techniques were much cruder, but we engaged in a lot of effort over the years to try and get the message about the depredations of the Soviet government and their aggressiveness abroad, and the corruption at home and their economic problems and so forth. We spent a lot of money and a lot of effort trying to get that message into the Soviet Union, and we're pretty successful at it. Mm-hmm. We just now need to move to the next level of technology and use the capabilities that are being used against us, against the Russians.
I spoke recently with Sue Gordon, who was until recently the number 2 at the Director of National Intelligence. She spent decades at the CIA, and she said one of her biggest concerns isn't so much the messing with U.S. election infrastructure. It is the misinformation. It is the manipulation. It is the distortion and undermining of U.S. institutions by sowing doubt in them. The president himself publicly and repeatedly says, don't trust the vote. Don't trust the methods of voting, that the election will be rigged. And in fact, that's the only way that he could lose, and it's the Democrats' fault. She said that message is Russia's message. Given the disproportionate responsibility the president has as commander-in-chief, how damaging is that when you hear that kind of message from the president?
Well, I think it's a mistake, and I think it does sort of buttress the message from the Russians. I agree with what you said that she had reported, and I think that one of the things that helps protect our election system from actually getting into the mechanics of how we count votes and how people vote is that the country is so decentralized, and there are thousands and thousands of voting systems and voting units and so on, from the county level to the state level and so on. And figuring out how to do that in a way that actually has an impact on the election, I think, is really pretty hard for a foreign government. By the same token, I totally agree with what she said. I think that the real damage that the Russians are doing is the planting of these messages that divide us and that go out, that basically scratch the scabs off of some of our national wounds and try and exacerbate the differences among us and provoke violence and provoke people to get out into the streets. And so those are the kinds of messages that I think are the most dangerous coming through the Russian effort. And I think the notion, one of Putin's themes all along, whether it's been in his involvement in the French election, where the Russians gave Marie Le Pen millions of euros in support, or their involvement in the Brexit vote, what they want to do is discredit democracy. Putin wants to send the message, look, these people are just as corrupt and their elections are just as rigged as ours are. So any message that I think conveys the notion that our elections are rigged reinforces the message that the Russians have been trying to send.
I want to ask you about Afghanistan. You said back in June that the U.S. could have and probably should have pulled out back in 2002. Right now, you have this diplomatic effort underway, and the U.S. pledging to pull down to about 4,000 troops or so by November. Do you see this diplomatic effort right now as just sort of a dressed up withdrawal strategy?
Well, I certainly hope not. And I think that, these negotiations have always been the only way out, the only way to end this conflict. And we were saying this in the Obama administration, but we were also saying it in the Bush administration. At some point, a negotiation between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban was the only way to bring this conflict to a close. So the question is, will the Afghan government be strong enough in trying to preserving their constitution, and in particular, both democracy and the rights of women? Will they be able to prevail in that? And it seems to me that our strategy, particularly in terms of our willingness to pull all of our troops out, ought to be tied to the path of those negotiations. And if our maintaining a residual modest force of a few thousand troops in Afghanistan for an indefinite period of time allows the Afghan government to remain strong enough to continue to take that position in the negotiations and to be able to sustain that position, it seems to me that would be a worthwhile investment. But our presence ought not be tied to campaign promises, but rather to our strategy and to our mission. By our presence, can we help sustain where we are now with the Afghan government in terms of the rights of women and so on, and children and girls in education and so on? Or do you basically just throw your hands up, get out, and let the chips fall where they may? I think that's, our men and women in uniform have made a pretty amazing sacrifice in Afghanistan over the past 19, 20 years. And I think if a little more patience and sustaining a few thousand troops will help bring about a conclusion that is more satisfactory, that's an investment we ought to make. But it ought to be based on strategy, not on politics.
But fundamentally, this is about a power sharing deal with the Taliban. Do you truly believe that the Taliban you talked about accepting the Constitution, that protects the rights of minorities, that protects the rights of women to vote, to be educated, just basically to exist in society in a way the Taliban never allowed them to when they ruled the entire country? Do you think that they actually will agree to that?
I think they will agree only if they have no alternative. And I think the key is making sure that there is no alternative. They control, based on everything I read, they control a little less than half the country right now. And so the question is, do you want to have a role in governing the whole country, or do you basically just want to dominate the East and the South? And is that good enough for you, the Taliban, while the government in Kabul remains the internationally recognized representative of the Afghan people? I think that the whole point of the negotiations is, how do you bring enough pressure to bear politically on the Taliban, and in terms of the leverage offered by the U.S. troops there, to get them to agree to those kinds of terms. But when all is said and done, in reality, only the Afghan government and the Afghan people can protect their own rights. Mm-hmm. We've been there for 18, 19 years trying to do that. We've expended a lot of lives and a lot of treasure in that effort. But when it's all said and done, only the Afghans are able to protect those rights against those who would deny them. We can help them. And the question is, as I've just been talking about, how can we help them at an acceptable cost to us now? But it's finally their responsibility.
You've talked in the past about the question of character. You said of candidate Trump back in 2016. He's stubbornly uninformed about the world, how to lead, and temperamentally unsuited to lead our men and women in uniform. But you also said of Joe Biden, he's a man of integrity, someone who you could turn to for help in a personal crisis. But, and you're smiling because you know what I'm going to say, he's been wrong on every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. Given these views on both of the candidates, what are you going to do? Write in a third candidate?
Well, I don't think that that's very helpful, frankly. I will keep my own views and what I'm going to do to myself. I think I come from a generation where that kind of thing used to be private, and I still feel that way. But I also will say this, I'm an Eagle Scout. For me, character counts.
Well, former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, a Republican, former CIA, NSA Director Michael Hayden, John Negroponte, former head of national intelligence, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, have all publicly come out and warned of the risks of President Trump's reelection. I understand you're saying this is a private choice, but how should people understand that when you have esteemed people from the national security establishment warning that the President of the United States is a risk?
Well, I think I said pretty much all of that 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago. So, I stand by what I wrote about the vice president. I stand by what I wrote about Donald Trump. But as I just said, when it comes to making my choice, I think character counts for a lot.
And how do you see this next election in terms of defining the course that the United States is on? I mean, it feels like there's a lot of upheaval at home and abroad right now.
I'm afraid that no matter how the election goes, the polarization in the country has reached a point that the period after the election and even after January is going to be tough. I think there's going to be a lot of resentment on the part of whoever lost, the advocates of whoever lost, and figuring out how to try and begin to bring people back together again, I think is going to be a challenge for either President Trump or a President Biden. I think that this is one of the biggest challenges facing our political leadership, and it's not just who is president; it's the members of Congress. And so on. And frankly, the media has become very polarized for the most part. And so everybody's got an oar in the water on this thing. And it also means that everybody's going to have to do their part in trying to figure out, how do we get past these differences and realize that we're all in this together. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that's going to face our political leadership going forward. The truth is our country has always had polarized politics. The name calling in this year's election is no worse than the name calling between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. What's different is polarization in recent years has led to paralysis. And the government can't address any of our big problems right now. It's frankly one of the big advantages on the international scene that the Chinese have. They point to us and they say they can't get anything done. They can't do anything on infrastructure or education or immigration or you name it. And at some point, our political leadership is going to have to say, hey, this paralysis is killing us as a country. We've got to figure out a way to compromise and come together on some of these issues. I think that's the biggest challenge facing whoever gets elected in November.
I agree with you and understand your words of caution and responsibility we all bear there. It will not be election night. It will be election week.
Or month.
Let's hope not, but you are right. And Secretary Gates, that concludes the amount of time that we have today. It's always great to talk to you, and I want to thank you for your time and for everyone who is watching virtually and to the Texas Tribune. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Margaret.